Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode. I'm your host, Brandon Cobb, co-founder of HPG Capital. And today I've got Dan Lewkowicz on the show. He is a seasoned real estate veteran with over 15 years of experience in many facets of the real estate industry. He started his career house hacking, quickly moved on to flipping houses around the Detroit metro area, eventually created a company called Renaissance Real Estate Ventures. They specialize in acquisition, financing, renovation, and resale of single-family residential properties in the booming city of Detroit. He's also senior director of Encore Real Estate Investment Services, and he's an awesome broker as well. We're going to jump into all this stuff today. But first, Dan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, man, it's great to have you. I'm excited to jump into some of the stuff that I've never had a guest on this show comment before. I want to get into the commercial stuff. A lot of people who've not gotten into commercial, they don't know what a lot of the buzzwords are with commercial, like triple net lease and net operating income, stuff like that, cap rates. We're going to dive in. For those that don't know who you are, what's your story?
Yeah, my name is Dan Lewkowicz, and again, thank you for having me on the show. I'm senior director here at Encore Real Estate Investment Services. I eat, sleep, breathe, drink real estate, commercial real estate. Been in the industry for a long time. Got my start, as you mentioned, house hacking. I should rewind that a little bit. My real start was back in 2005. I started a company with some friends called Disability Made Easy, barrier-free home modification company. We modified homes to make them handicap accessible for people with terminal illness, disability, injury, etc. The motivation, the impetus for this business was that my best friend's father had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And in addition to the frustrations of managing the illness, he also had to manage a contractor for the grab bars, manage a contractor for the shower, manage a contractor for the ramp, manage a contractor for the stair glide. And it just became a big hassle and headache. So we created a one-stop shop. And the reason I bring this up is that I had a moment. This was a big aha moment for me. I was traveling to a location with our project manager, and we got to this house, and we went in the house, and there was a man who had gotten in a car accident 25 years prior. He was in a wheelchair, and this house was like the worst possible design for him. Walked outside. I said to the project manager, I said, let's load up the van. Let's get out of here. There's no hope in this situation. Like, nothing can be done. He didn't say a word, but he picked up his graph paper and his pencil. And about 90 seconds later, he sketched a brand new front elevation, a brand new layout to the property. And to me, I recognized that there were things that could be done to a piece of real estate to make it more functional and to take it out of that category of being obsolete. And for me, what that meant was when it came time for me to buy my first house for my family, I had a choice to buy something that was like 100% move-in ready, or to work with the bank. This was during the last, real estate downturn, to work with the bank, buy a property that was obsolete, right? That needed a lot of work. But after I bought the property and added in those renovations, the sum created for me instant equity. And for me, that led me on a journey of flipping houses. After I did my own home, I flipped probably 100 houses at this point in my career. And that was something that I was, always doing on the side until I started at Renaissance Real Estate Ventures and, started flipping full time, building crews, doing, things at scale. And eventually I went in full time to commercial real estate brokerage. And that's where I've been ever since. Still, flip the occasional house. It's kind of like, to me, it's an itch that is hard not to scratch. I look at it kind of, for me, it was like the gateway drug into real estate investment. Do a lot of commercial real estate investing on the side, but my main gig is as a commercial real estate broker, and I specialize specifically in net lease, which I'm sure we'll talk about today.
So why net lease? Why commercial?
So for me, you're asking, why did I get into it?
Yes. Why did you pick that over everything that you've done? You had this background, flipping houses, you know, what made you settle on that specific niche?
Great question. So, I had jobs all along the way, professional jobs. I ran a sales department for a title insurance agency, and I did that because I wanted to learn about title because I was like a real estate investor. I worked as a development director for a large Jewish day school doing fundraising. I worked for Amazon as a business development executive. And when I was at Amazon, my dad he pushed me. He said, Dan, you got to get into the real estate department in Amazon, because Amazon, what they do is they take dirt and bricks and sticks, and they sign a lease and they turn it into A+ trophy real estate that all of a sudden is worth a tremendous amount. So I started thinking about that. And again, that appeals to me, right? I love that concept of value add. I love taking a house, renovating it, making it better, making it worth more than you're into it for. I love the idea of taking some dirt, building a warehouse, signing a lease, adding value. So it really started to get me thinking about the whole idea of net lease, of these banner tenants, these A+ trophy tenants signing long-term leases backed by tremendous credit, making the real estate worth a lot of money. And at the same time, I was recruited by a net lease brokerage. They reached out to me and said, we're looking for top salespeople at different corporations to get them into position as a commercial real estate broker. And I said, you know what? This is my opportunity. This is my opportunity to learn about that industry. This is my opportunity to work on deals where, people are taking bricks and sticks and dirt and making them much more valuable by signing these long-term leases. And at the same time, I was then, flipping houses full time. And I was thinking to myself, like, man, like I'm getting calls at midnight about houses getting broken into. I'm having cabinets stolen and HVAC units stolen. I'm having to deal with like all these different challenges. I'm putting out my own money. I'm raising investor capital. I'm borrowing hard money. I'm working day and night. I've got my phone is ringing. I've got all these responsibilities. I'm literally wearing steel-toed boots. Like I'm running around to job sites. I'm doing what I called at the time adult daycare of managing contractors. It's so active. And at the same time, I can sit in an office and I can, do almost everything from my phone and from my computer. And I can do these tremendous commercial real estate deals. And, my best flip it pales in comparison to an average commercial real estate commission. So for me, it made a lot of sense conceptually as to why net lease, but also brokerage wise made a lot of sense practically for where I was in my life at the time.
Okay, so let's break that down. What is a triple net lease?
So a triple net lease, we're going to start with what's called an absolute triple net lease. I call it an absolute triple net lease because there's some parts in the country where they confuse a little bit, their jargon or their nomenclature to avoid any ambiguity. We'll start with an absolute triple net lease. And the way I like to describe what an absolute triple net lease is by comparing it to something and showing what it isn't. Okay. So a lot of people, maybe everybody is familiar with your classic multifamily deal. So
Right.
I'm going to compare that to a classic absolute triple net deal. So the absolute triple net deal that we're dealing with is going to be a Wendy's. Okay. It's your average Wendy's. It's off an exit on the freeway. Maybe this one has a corporate guarantee. Maybe it's guaranteed by an operator that has 300 Wendy's. That's very important, by the way, to see who guarantees the lease. We'll talk about that later, I'm sure. In this specific example, in the lease, it says that Wendy's, the tenant, is to pay the owner, the landlord, $125,000 of base rent. So if you looked at your profit and loss statement, your top line number, your gross income, $125,000. Let's flip over to the multifamily deal. Small multifamily deal. Let's say you got 10 units that are paying, $12,500 a year, roughly. And I'm kind of making this up as we go, but the concept still stands. Again, $125,000 of gross collected rents, top line income number on your profit and loss report, $125,000. They look exactly the same. Okay. But in the multifamily deal, there's certain things as the operator, as the owner, you're going to have to pay for. You're going to have to pay for taxes. You're going to have to pay for insurance. You're going to have to pay for maintenance. You're going to have to pay to replace the roof or fix the roof. You're going to have to pay, there's going to be a vacancy factor. You're going to have to pay to salt and plow the parking lot and the sidewalks. You're going to have to mow the lawn. Okay. You're going to have to paint the facility, all kinds of different numbers. So at the end of the day, on a typical multifamily deal, you might have $125,000 of base rent, of gross collected rents, a gross income, but you might have $60,000 or $65,000 in expenses. So you might be left with half. Maybe you're left with $60,000 or $65,000 of net operating income after subtracting all of those expenses. Back over to the absolute triple net Wendy's deal, $125,000 base income. That's your gross collected rent. Guess what? Tenant pays your taxes. Tenant pays your insurance. Tenant pays for any management. Tenant pays for any maintenance. They're going to pay to shovel the snow and mow the grass and plow the parking lot. If the property needs a new roof or needs new windows or needs new paint, they're going to do that. They're going to pay to repair any parking lot potholes or replace the parking lot, all that good stuff. So at the end of the day, your net operating income after zero expenses is $125,000. Now, just to touch on what I was hinting at before, that's called an absolute triple net lease. Okay. The landlord is responsible for nothing. The tenant pays for taxes and insurance. all common area maintenance, all property maintenance, roof structure, parking lot, everything. There is what's called a double net lease, which is exactly the same with the following differences. So the tenant pays taxes, insurance, common area maintenance. However, they do not pay for roof and structure, and depending on the lease, sometimes not for parking lot and or sidewalks. So a little bit less desirable. I just wanted to touch on that because that is another type of lease that we deal with.
Wow. So what I took from that is, in a nutshell, an absolute triple net lease. And I want to emphasize the word absolute. Basically, the tenant pays for everything. And so
Everything.
that rent check that you get every month, you keep almost 100% of it, all of 100%
100%
of
of
it,
it. Yeah.
100% of it. Okay. Now I want to dive into this here in a second, but you said something earlier that caught my attention that is really important, something that I did not know. Again, I want to go revisit this triple net lease thing here in a second. So like, stick a toothpick in it, hang on. How does having a triple net lease increase the value of the property? You said that based on what type of leasing agreement and tenant you have in the building, you said that that can influence the value of the real estate. Is that right?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. Like, look, right now I'm going to work in reverse, but like right now we've got a tremendous amount of pharmacies that are going vacant. Rite Aid filed for bankruptcy. They closed every single location in Michigan and Ohio, for example. A lot of Walgreens are not renewing their leases. So if we were to backfill that property with, let's say, Dollar General or Family Dollar, they after the pharmacy tenant leaves, they might pay $120,000 of rent, okay? Whereas Walgreens could have been paying $350,000 of rent. Walgreens were trading at a lower cap rate. So like, I mean, the difference in value is astounding. I'm going to pull out a calculator real quick just to show you. So $120,000, right, at let's call it a 7.5 cap for the dollar store, that's 1.6 million. 350,000 at a 6.5 cap is $5,384,000. I mean, same building, right? Same exact building, different sign, different tenant, different rent that they're paying, and different market cap. I mean, you're looking at close to $4.5 million or more of difference in
Wow.
value. It's huge, right? It's absolutely huge. That's number one. Number two, if you look at any given building, things like the guarantor size and strength matter. So I've got a client that I sell Wendy's for. He has 13 units. I've got another, client that has, I should clarify, he's the owner of the real estate and the operator. I've got other tenants, other clients that own Wendy's properties that have 400 unit guarantors. So the value of the property when there's only 13 units or 3 units or 2 units or 1 unit is substantially lower than if there's 400 units. Because if that property goes vacant, if they're having a hard time selling there or running their operation or finding labor or whatever it is, if there's only a couple units in the guarantee, maybe that entity will go bankrupt. If there's 400 units that are publicly traded, the likelihood is a lot lower. It does happen. It's happening right now with, entities like Rite Aid, but it's a lot less common. That's number one. Number two, certain tenants pay higher rent, right? I just mentioned this tenant, pharmacy tenants typically pay a lot higher rent than other tenants like dollar stores. Medical tenants typically pay a lot higher rent. So, the things like the guarantor size and strength, the amount of rent that they're paying, if there's escalations in the lease, some leases are flat. They have no escalations in the rent. Some leases have 2% annual escalations. That's going to be much more valuable because your average return is going to go up during the term of the lease. And in addition to that, the lease term is important. If you have 1 year left on the lease, and I can give a great example of this later, but 1 year left on the lease, your cap rate is going to go way up because your risk goes way up. They may not stay. If it has 10 or 15 years on the lease, the risk goes lower because you have 10 or 15 years of guaranteed rent that you're going to collect. So all those variables will go into what impacts the value of a property. That's why a broker is essential. That's why Zillow is not going to replace me, because Zillow can't just go and say, oh, this property's worth this property's worth this, because Zillow doesn't know the lease terms. You cannot drive by a Wendy's or a Walgreens and tell me what it's worth without knowing the terms of the lease.
So your lease can exponentially, 3, 4, 5x the value of that property based on who you have in there. So yeah, let's break that down. So, all right. This is huge right now, for those listening to this that own commercial buildings and maybe they're not privy to this information. It's like, hey, you want the best tenant. So certain tenants, number one, certain tenants are worth more than the others. Two, because it could be like a Wendy's, like you said, someone's going to value that more than some local business that's like a startup, right? Then the second, it seems, is the number of units that this guarantor has. So using Wendy's for an example, the value of that property or the value of that lease is going to go up proportional to the number of units that that guarantor has. And AKA, if this is a guarantor or owner that has 11 Wendy's versus 400 Wendy's,
Right.
that's a lot less risk of you losing it. It seems like those are like two of the big sticking points in determining the value of that you can increase. Did I miss anything there?
Definitely lease term is important because if there's, like I
Lease
said, 1
terms,
year left versus 15 years, big
right?
difference in value. And then you're going to want to look at the rent. I mean, the rent is huge. If like cap rate can only overcome rent to a certain degree. If the tenant's paying 120,000, there's no cap rate that's realistic that will make the property worth more than if they're paying 350,000. So that's important. But I tell my buyers, my clients who are buying, you want to be careful. You want to make sure when you're buying that you have replaceable rent. All these people that bought the pharmacies over the last 20, 25 years, they didn't have replaceable rent. They had tenants that were paying 20, 25, $30 a foot in a market where anybody else was paying 12 or 13. That's a problem, right? You need to, that's like, saying, well, I'm renting this house out to somebody and I'm buying it and they're paying $4,000 a month. So I'm going to pay a ton of money for the property. But guess what? If they move out, everybody else in the neighborhood is paying 1,000. The value is going to go down. The same thing is true with net lease.
Wow, very interesting. Okay, so you talked about absolute net lease. What's the difference between absolute net lease and then your basic triple net lease? I feel like that's important.
Yeah, so I'm only doing that because like certain parts of the country on the western side of the country, they call a triple net lease what I call a double net lease, that type of property where the landlord's responsible for roof and structure and sometimes parking lot and or sidewalk. So I
Mm,
would call that a double net lease. In some parts of the country, they call that a triple net lease. And then they call an absolute net lease the type of property where there's zero landlord responsibilities. So for me, to avoid ambiguity, I just go absolute triple net lease, double net
okay,
lease. That way
I see.
everybody knows what we're talking about.
They're using some lexicon that's it's the same, but it's a little bit different in how they
Right.
describe it. Okay.
Right.
And so if like I own a commercial property right now over and it's like North Nashville, can I just tell all the tenants like, hey, this is a triple net lease and like you have to do it? Like, can this be done with any commercial property, or are there some specific parameters that make the triple net lease viable for a certain property where it might not be viable for another?
Yeah. So, I mean, theoretically, you could structure a triple net lease on any property. I mean, you could do it for residential property if you want. It's not the norm, and no one's going to go for it. You could tell the tenant you pay for taxes, insurance, roof, structure, everything, and all they're going to do is lower your rent. But all joking aside, you can do it, right? But you have to do it at a time when a new lease is being signed, because if they already have a lease in place that dictates the terms of the relationship between tenant and landlord, you can't just go in there and upend it. So a good
Right.
example is shopping centers. I sell a lot of shopping centers. Shopping centers typically, just to simplify things, they have two types of leases. They have the absolute triple net lease that I mentioned, and I'll explain how it's a little different in a shopping center in a moment. And then they have a gross lease or a gross modified lease. So with the first option that I just mentioned, what happens is the tenant pays base rent, and then they also pay what is called the CAM charge, common area maintenance, or CAM charge, or triple net charge. And that can be structured in different ways. One of the most common ways it's structured in a per square foot amount. So they might pay $12 a foot in base rent, and then the landlord will charge them $3.82 a foot in triple net charges or CAM charges. And maybe there's a clause in the lease that says that the landlord, right, at the end of the year, they can reconcile all expenses. And if they see that the expenses went up, they'll charge each tenant their pro rata share. So if it's a shopping center that's 10,000 square feet and their suite is 1,200 square feet, they will pay 12%, right? So that's one way that it's structured, a very common way that it's structured. So the landlord will take care of maintaining the parking lot, paying for things like taxes and insurance, utilities, and then they'll bill that back to the tenant in various different ways. I just explained one way. Now, gross lease is the tenant pays $15 a foot, for example, and that's gross, right? That is gross. So the landlord is responsible for taxes, insurance, maintenance, management, everything. Okay. So what I tell my clients is if you have a building, if you're buying a building and it's got gross leases, whenever those leases roll over, whenever it's time for a new lease, negotiate a triple net lease for a few reasons. Number one, it helps you to stabilize your expenses, right? Because if expenses go up, you're passing that through to the tenant. Your expenses don't go up. Number one. Number two, you have a relatively fixed income stream. You know what to expect. You can often increase your net operating income because you'll be able to lower expenses, and have less expenses fall through to you. And then also, most investors are willing to pay a lower cap rate or a higher price for a shopping center that has triple net leases. So you'll be able to do that value add like I love and build up some equity just by modifying the lease.
That's so interesting to me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just by switching out the tenant and the leasing terms, increasing the value of the property, that's a no brainer because the way my brain works, we do a lot of development. And so everything value add is like, hey, let's put in utilities in this ground. Like there's a lot of work
Yeah.
involved and a lot of capital involved in it. I think like capital, there's work involved in everything, but like capital involved, whereas like this value add strategy, what I love about it is we're just shifting who we're putting into it, what the contract says and what they pay for. It's
100%.
literally, it just requires brains and no capital, which is what I love about this.
Yeah, listen, for myself coming from this value add house renovation
Yeah.
perspective, I love it because exactly like you said. And I want to just real quick, if it's okay, give you an example that I think really hammers this home.
Yes, please.
So this is a real deal. It's about, I don't know, 3-4 years ago. So the cap rates are not reflective of today's commercial real estate environment, but the principles remain the same. So I'm going to use the same cap rates and use the same numbers as the actual example. So I have a client. I was talking to my client. This guy built a shopping center. They're builders. They built a Walgreens that's in the shopping center. He said to me, Dan, I built this building 25 years ago. I got like 14 months left on the lease. I'm done with it. Like I got my cash flow. I got my depreciation. I'm ready to sell. So I did what every broker doesn't do. I said, do not sell. Okay. This is not the time to sell. And he kind of is scratching his head over the phone. And he said, what do you mean?
Because
So
you're a broker and he's like, wait a minute, what? You don't want the commission? That's kind of weird.
right. Well, I wanted to add the value for him. And I'll explain how. So at the time, Walgreens was paying $290,000 worth of rent. And remember, 14 months left on the lease, high risk deal, very short term. At the time, that was trading at about a 9 cap. Okay. So $290,000 at a 9% return puts a value of $3.222 million. So let's remember that number, $3.222 million. That's what the property's worth. Now watch me add a tremendous amount of value to this property with the stroke of a pen. So I told my client, I said, you need, his name is Barry. I said, Barry, you need to go to Walgreens and you need to tell him you want a fresh 10-year lease. He's like, okay, I'll have that call. No problem. And he went and had that call and he came back to me. He said, Dan, I called Walgreens. They said they'll give me a fresh 10-year lease, but I'm not doing it. I said, why not? He said, they want me to lower my rent all the way from $290,000 a year all the way to $225,000, $65,000 a year. Dan, are you crazy? Not only do you not want the listing, but you're telling me to lower my income? Like, what's wrong with you? I said, Barry, hold on a second. Remember your property? We were going to list it at $3.222 million, right? That's what it's worth in the current situation. Well, now a 10-year lease Walgreens is trading at a 5.85 cap. So let's do the math, right? We do 225,000, so $65,000 less.
Yeah.
At a 5.85 cap is a whopping $3,846,000. So merely by stroking the pen, right, on that amendment, changing it to a 10-year lease and lowering the rent, this equity buildup is still to the tune of what? $624,000? Isn't that something?
Wow. An additional $600,000 because it was trading at a lower cap rate because there's less risk because you got a 10-year lease in place with a very strong A+ tenant.
Despite the significant decrease in rent.
That's so cool. So what was his reaction?
His reaction was, wow, this is amazing. I've got a 10-year lease. He was super happy. Long story short, I don't understand why, but he ended up refinancing it as part of a portfolio and kind of said, well, now I got a 10-year lease, might as well keep it. So maybe shot myself in the foot, but I did what was best for the client, and that's all that matters.
Yeah, man. No, people remember stuff like that, and
Yep, they do.
they come back and do business. Like a decade later, you get a call, and it's like, hey, he's got a whole portfolio now that he's got to sell. So just delayed gratification there, dude. This has been so eye opening with everything. This is so cool. If people want to learn more about you, learn more about business, learn more about your brokerage as well, and some of these same value add services, how they can capitalize on the same types of situation that you just helped this client with using your knowledge, where do they go?
I mean, first of all, I'm very active on LinkedIn. I put out daily content. My name is Dan, obviously, last name Lewkowicz. In case you're listening to this, it's Lewkowicz. Again, Lewkowicz. Reach out to me, connect with me there. Mention how that you heard me on this podcast, right? Additionally, if you own commercial real estate and you want to know what it's worth, if you want to sell it, if you're not really sure, if you're new to investing, new to brokerage, you want somebody to talk to. I love commercial real estate. One of the most rewarding aspects of my career are the phone calls and the lunches and the coffees that I have with people, who tell me about what's going on, and we talk about it. And then 6 months later, they reach out and tell me how amazing things are. So please reach out by all means. I'm going to give out my personal cell phone number. It's 248-943-2838. Again, 248-943-2838. If there's anything I can do to be of assistance or add value, it would definitely be my absolute pleasure.
We will make sure that all that information gets posted in the show notes here. So if you want to reach out to Dan, you can. It's been a pleasure having you on the show, my friend.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. This was great. I really appreciate you having me.
And hey, if you get value from this episode, show Dan some love, show me some love, leave us a review, and share these with your friends and family. We will see you guys next time.